The Unexpurgated Pike Report. Forward by Philip Agee. Report of the House Select Committee on Intelligence, 1976. Introduction by Philip Agee. Pike will pay for this. You wait and see. We will destroy him for this. Strong words quoted on the floor of the U.S. House of Representatives by Congressman Otis Pike himself. He was quoting from an alleged threat made by Mitchell Rogovan, the CIA's Special Counsel for Legal Affairs, to Cyril Field, staff director of the House Select Committee on Intelligence headed by Pike. According to Pike, the CIA's counsel went on, "I'm serious. There will be political retaliation. Any political ambitions in New York that Pike had are through. We will destroy him for this." Pike's revelation of the threats, which were immediately denied by the CIA's counsel, came on March 9, 1976, a month after his committee for investigating the CIA had submitted its recommendations and gone out of existence. Even if the threats were never made, or if they were in fact expressed in a milder, more suggestive fashion, they were consistent with the controversy within the committee and its stormy relations with the executive branch that had prevailed from the time the committee was established 13 months earlier. In his denunciation of the threats, Pike was reacting to a series of events that culminated only days earlier when New York's weekly Village Voice and special supplements on February 16th and 23rd, 1976, published most of the secret report based on the work of Pike's investigating committee. Publication of the report, highlights of which had already leaked into the press from January 20th onwards, provoked an emotional and angry outburst from Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, who was criticized severely in the report for his passion for secrecy and for making false statements to the Congress. At a news conference, Kissinger denounced the committee's, quote, totally irresponsible behavior, the misuse of highly classified information in a tendentious and misleading manner that must do damage to the foreign policy of the United States, the use of classified information in a manner that is so distorted that the total impact is to produce a malicious lie, a new version of McCarthyism, end quote. Meanwhile, a spokesman for the White House said President Ford believed the report published in the Village Voice was leaked by someone in the Congress, while Congressman Pike suggested that it was leaked by the executive branch to help the CIA by making the committee look bad. Only days later, in early March, the CIA claimed that the committee had failed to return and couldn't find some 230 documents, at least some of which were classified secret, that the agency had given the committee in the course of its investigation. Pike had problems with his own House of Representatives as well. As significant leaks of the report began to appear in the New York Times and other publications during the last 2 weeks of January 1976, then CIA Director William Colby pleaded with the House not to publish the report, because to do so would damage the country's intelligence activities and endanger agency operations. Then, on January 29th, the full House voted to suppress publication until the White House had been able to censor it, an action tantamount to a rebuke by the House to its own investigating committee. After the vote against him, Pike described his committee's work as an exercise in futility and lamented that the House, quote, probably will not ever have a strong oversight committee, end quote. Nevertheless, despite the House's submission to the executive and despite renewed public sympathy towards the CIA with the executive's adroit manipulation of the killing of Richard Welch, the CIA station chief in Athens, in December, and despite the backlash against the continued leaks, not just from the House report, it should be noted, despite all these factors militating against disclosure of the report, it got out. In late January, someone still unidentified gave a copy of the report to Daniel Shore, the CBS television news reporter based in Washington, who began using parts of the report in his broadcasting when its full publication was expected shortly, before the House voted to allow executive censorship. After the House vote, Shore tried first to get the report published in book form, but in the anti-release of secrets atmosphere prevailing in February, his only sure outlet was the Village Voice. After The Voice published, Shore explained, quote, "I found myself unexpectedly, because of a surprise action by the House, in possession of possibly the only available copy of a report bearing no classification on its face, its principal sensations already divulged. My problem was that doing nothing would mean that I would be suppressing a report that might be interesting as a matter of public record." End quote. Shore's admission brought calls in the House for revocation of his congressional press credentials, while at the same time the Department of Justice pondered whether he should be prosecuted under the espionage laws, thus reviving First Amendment issues left unresolved when the Pentagon Papers trial of Daniel Ellsberg and Anthony Russo was aborted during the Watergate scandals. The House voted to have its Ethics Committee, House Committee on Standards of Official Conduct, investigate the leak, later appropriating $150,000 for the effort. CBS, for its part, suspended Shore from all reporting duties pending the outcome of the congressional investigation. Shore was clearly and surprisingly on the defensive. What had happened in the United States during the 2 months since Welch's death? It seemed that the American public had had enough. Almost 2 years had passed, beginning with publication in May 1974 after a long court battle of the CIA and the cult of intelligence, during which one scandal and abuse after another were charged to the CIA, FBI, and other security agencies. After an initial overlap with the Watergate episode and the end of the Nixon presidency, the scandals had grown dramatically, with revelations of the CIA's subversion of the Allende government in Chile, September 1974, and of the CIA's massive illegal domestic operations, December 1974. My own book on the CIA appeared first in January 1975, the same month President Ford appointed the Rockefeller Commission to investigate the CIA's domestic activities, and the same month the Senate established its investigating committee under Senator Frank Church. By February 1976, when the Pike Report was published, a large sector of the American public seemed not to want to hear it, some, no doubt, having no more stomach for scandal, disillusion, and moral conflict. Others, surely because they were beginning to realize just how damaging the revelations had become. In the midst of the controversy, on February 17th, President Ford seized more initiative by announcing his reform plan for the CIA and other security services. With media coverage that only an American president can command, Ford described his executive order to strengthen the intelligence agencies, and he recommended to Congress a new law providing fines and prison terms for persons who disclose classified information. In his appeal for new legislation, Ford said, quote, "It is essential that the irresponsible and danger exposure of our nation's intelligence secrets be stopped. Openness is a hallmark of our democratic society, but the American people have never believed that it was necessary to reveal secret war plans of the Department of Defense, and I do not think they wish to have true intelligence secrets revealed either." End quote. Nevertheless, the world already had the Pike Report, a truly extraordinary and revealing document, thanks to the persistence and courage of Otis Pike and the members of his committee, of Daniel Shore, and of the Village Voice. When reading the report, one should keep in mind not only the conflicting circumstances surrounding its original publication, but also the quite real possibilities that existed during the committee's early months. First, that the committee would make no real investigation, or second, that the committee would be abolished before even beginning its work. Established by a House resolution in February 1975, the Select Committee on Intelligence was first placed under the chairmanship of Representative Lucien Nedzi of Michigan, who is also the chairman of the House Armed Services Intelligence Subcommittee. Since this subcommittee had for many years exercised the House's watchdog responsibility over the CIA, Nedzi, as chairman of the Select Committee, would in a very real sense be investigating his own performance. Fortunately, he was subject to some strong and effective pushing from two Select Committee members whose opposition to the CIA's clandestine interventions abroad was well known: Michael Harrington of Massachusetts and Ronald Dellums of California. Even so, by June 1975, the committee had hardly turned a stone when the New York Times dropped a blockbuster on them. On June 5th, the Times revealed that 2 years earlier, Nedzi had been briefed by the new CIA director, William Colby, on the results of a recent CIA in-house investigation of assassinations, illegal operations, and other abuses. Nedzi had taken no action and had not even informed the other members of his House Armed Services Intelligence Subcommittee. Harrington, Dellums, and liberals on the Select Committee demanded Nedzi's resignation, which he gave, but which was refused by the full House in a vote on June 16th. Thereafter, Nedzi refused to function as chairman of the Select Committee, and a move began to abolish it. Complicating the impasse was Nedzi's refusal to make classified information available to Harrington from Nedzi's Armed Services Intelligence Subcommittee, because Harrington had been partly responsible for the leaking in September 1974 of details of the CIA's subversion of the Allende government. Harrington's information had come from the subcommittee documents of Nedzi, who was determined not to give Harrington any more ammunition. Finally, on July 17th, the House abolished the Select Committee under Nedzi and established a new Select Committee under the chairmanship of Otis Pike. Both Nedzi and Harrington were left off the new committee, which set about the investigation that eventually produced the Pike Report. In one of those apparent contradictions not uncommon in American politics, Pike, 54, son of a Republican Long Island banker and representative of a conservative Long Island district, a Democratic Party member since he was 21, and foe of expensive Pentagon weapons projects, was responsible for some of the most important and enlightening revelations on CIA operations to date. Part 1 of the Select Committee's report, published in the February 23rd issue of The Voice, detailed the delays, obstructions, and refusals by members of the executive, mainly Director Colby, Secretary Kissinger, and President Ford, to provide the documents needed by the committee for its investigation. The main administration tactic was to delay turning over documents, in spite of the president's public assurances that he would cooperate in making available all material in the executive branch. This tactic eventually provoked a number of subpoenas by the Pike Committee, some of which at length brought forth the documents. Yet the administration, knowing that the committee had a short lifetime and was working against an approaching deadline, stalled on issue after issue in order to conceal a maximum amount of material over the investigative period. Thus, the committee, which wasted the February through July period in internal disputes, really only had about 5 months, from August to December 1975, to do its investigation and get a report written and submitted to the House by its January 31st, 1976 deadline. Besides delay, the executive agencies also at times rendered important documents useless by excising significant content and even by flatly refusing to turn over documents requested by the committee. Finally, fierce battles were fought over the public release of information obtained by the committee, both over the specific information and the manner of release. Usually the reason given was some questionable allegation that revelation would endanger the sources and methods of the CIA or one of the other agencies. Yet another tactic was to prevent testimony by certain witnesses, as in the case of the State Department officer in charge of the Cyprus desk at the time of the coup against Makarios. This officer had written a dissenting report on the handling of intelligence in the State Department at the time of the Cyprus crisis, but he was prevented by Kissinger from testifying on what had happened and why he dissented. In another instance, a witness who had revealed financial improprieties in FBI purchasing of wiretapping equipment was afterwards subjected to a 6-hour interview by 2 FBI agents who convinced him to sign a statement recanting insignificant details of his testimony. The witness later repudiated that statement, claiming intimidation by the 2 FBI agents. With all the administration's delays, refusals of documents, interference with testimony, and deletions of content, there can be no doubt that President Ford, Secretary Kissinger, and Director Colby, to name only the major administration figures, were determined to prevent the Pike Committee from making a thorough and effective investigation. In this respect, the charge can validly be made that the administration tried a cover-up operation with the Pike Committee and, to a certain degree, probably succeeded. Yet, the content of Part 2 of the committee's report is most extraordinary and revealing. The major sections deal with costs, failures to anticipate important events, and an analysis of covert action operations between 1965 and 1975. We find that the total U.S. intelligence budget exceeds $10 billion. The Congress, however, which appropriates the money, has been told consistently that intelligence costs much less because intelligence activities have been placed in non-intelligence categories in the budget exercises. On analysis, the foreign intelligence budget was found to total between 3 and 4 times more than Congress was told, while the domestic budget was more than 5 times the reported amount. The committee found accountability for secret funds lacking and the consequent spending abuses considerable. One CIA station, for example, spent $41,000 on whiskey and other alcoholic beverages during 1971, after which the station chief was placed in charge of agency operations in Angola. Failure to anticipate major events in recent years reflects, in the Select Committee's view, serious shortcomings of the entire U.S. intelligence apparatus. The Tet Offensive of 1968, for example, wasn't foreseen, partly, at least, because of the American prejudiced, degraded view of the Viet Cong. Because the technical monitoring system lost track of the Russian army in Poland during the first 2 weeks in August 1968, American intelligence failed to detect the first Warsaw Pact invasion move against Czechoslovakia. President Johnson's first news of the invasion came from Soviet Ambassador Dobrynin in Washington. Similarly, the Egyptian and Syrian attacks that launched the Yom Kippur in 1973 caught the intelligence community by surprise, as did the coup in Portugal in April 1974, the Indian nuclear explosion in May 1974, and the coup against the Makarios government in Cyprus in July 1974. The Select Committee's review of CIA covert action operations is perhaps the most interesting section of the report. Unfortunately, the committee's attention was limited to the covert action projects approved by the 40 Committee during the 1965 to 1975 period. As only the most sensitive and costly projects required approval by 40 Committee, composed of the Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs, the Deputy Secretary of Defense, the Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and the Director of Central Intelligence, the Select Committee's investigation missed the vast majority of these kinds of operations which would have been approved internally in the CIA. Nevertheless, the revelations on covert action in the report are quite significant. We find, for example, that interference in the revered free electoral processes of other countries was the largest covert action category, comprising 32% of the 40 Committee approvals. 29% of approvals were for media and propaganda operations in which American government sponsorship was to be hidden. 23% of approvals were for paramilitary operations involving secret support to foreign armies and irregular military groups in the form of finance, training, and weapon supplies. Still other CIA covert action operations involved CIA finding of a plethora of civic, religious, professional, and trade union organizations. In-depth analysis appear in the Select Committee's report of 3 major covert action projects, each of great interest. Intervention in Italian elections since 1948 cost the CIA $75 million, including $10 million spent in 1972 alone. Most of this money went to the Christian Democrats, although Ambassador Graham Martin obtained, over the CIA's objection, a donation of $800,000 in 1972 for political forces of the Italian neo-fascist movement. The ambassador insisted on the donation in order to, quote, demonstrate solidarity for the long pole, end quote. Underlining the CIA's intervention in Italy was the revelation in early 1976 from government sources other than the Select Committee that President Ford had approved in December 1975 in the Italian electoral process during the months preceding the next Italian elections. At the time of approval, it was not known that elections would be held as soon as June 1976. Paramilitary support by the CIA to the Kurdish rebellion against the Iraqi government from 1972 to 1975, which cost some $16 million, was initiated at the request of the Shah of Iran, then engaged in a border dispute with Iraq. Once the Iraqis agreed to a settlement favorable to Iran, the Shah had the support to the Kurds cut off. The rebellion collapsed. Over 200,000 Kurds became refugees, and neither Iran nor the U.S. set up adequate refugee assistance. As one high-ranking but unidentified witness told the Select Committee, quote, covert action should not be confused with missionary work, end quote. The third major covert action operation examined by the Pike Committee was the CIA's intervention in Angola in support of the Holden Roberto and Jonas Savimbi forces. Here we find the conclusion that the massive Soviet and Cuban was in large part a reaction to the CIA's poor intervention that threatened to upset the three-way stalemate existing before the CIA got going. As a final observation on covert action operations, and one that is perhaps the most important of all, the Pike Committee destroyed the doctrine of plausible denial, whereby a president or secretary of state could plead ignorance if operations went awry. In public testimony, Secretary Kissinger admitted that every CIA operation of consequence was approved by the president, under the Ford as well as previous administrations. And in its report, the committee concludes, quote, all evidence in hand suggests that the CIA, far from being out of control, had been utterly responsive to the instructions of the president and the assistant to the president for national security affairs, end quote. For all the valuable information contained in the Pike Committee's report, one most important area of CIA operations was completely overlooked, possibly because the committee considered the matter too hot to handle. These are the relations between the CIA and foreign intelligence and security services, commonly known in the agency as liaison operations. Through these operations, the CIA trains, finances, and in varying degrees guides the foreign services into operations that will help the CIA. Over the years, the CIA has played a major role in the growth and strengthening of many of the world's most dreaded and cruel security services: the South Korean CIA, the Indonesian KOPKAMTIB, the THU security services in South Vietnam, the SAVAK in Iran, the OBAN, CODI, DOPS, and SNI in Brazil, the DINA in Chile, and the Federal Police in Argentina. These services and others helped by the CIA happen to be the most notorious practitioners of institutionalized torture and murder in the free world today. They also happen to be the main sustaining force for the gross social and economic injustices prevailing in their countries. Nowhere in the Pike Report can one find an indication that the Select Committee even considered the CIA's role in promoting and supporting such repressive security services. On the contrary, the committee laments the termination of the aid public safety programs of assistance to foreign police services, a legitimate foreign aid program, because of the CIA's involvement in it and bad publicity such as the film Stage of Siege. If the committee had wanted to get the truth, it could have discovered that the public safety programs were an extension of operations already initiated by the CIA to establish better internal security in foreign countries, and that the CIA has continued police assistance work even though the public safety programs were abolished. If the Select Committee had investigated the CIA's liaison operations, They would also have discovered that these operations, while considered within the CIA to be primarily counterintelligence in nature, produce results quite similar to most covert action operations, i.e., they strengthen certain political forces and weaken others, just as propaganda, labor, and election operations do. Only Congressman Ronald Dellums, in arguing for abolition of all covert action operations in the recommendations section of the report, is willing to face the political issue. Where have covert operations taken us? Are the nations that we have been involved with free democratic societies where the masses of people have benefits of democracy? Or are those nations, for the most part, military dictators, right-wing juntas, or regimes with extraordinary wealth and power in the hands of a few elitists? If the latter holds, it totally contradicts stated principles of this country. If we have been involved in covert actions which generated democracy, freedom, and justice around the world, maybe we might arrive at some different conclusion. But I don't think anyone can justify continued covert action on grounds that we foster and develop democracy around the world." End quote. Part 3 of the Pike Report outlines the Select Committee's 32 recommendations, together with additional recommendations of individual committee members. This section was not meant to be kept secret, and was not published by the Village Voice with Parts 1 and 2. At its last session on February 10th, the committee approved the recommendations, which were then filed with the Clerk of the House for possible future action, and they were simultaneously released to the press. In fact, there was little likelihood that the House would take early action on the proposals, partly because of the emerging U.S. electoral campaigns, but mainly because of the general backlash against intelligence community reformers following the Welch death and the spate of leaked secrets, including Parts 1 and 2 of the Pike Report. Most of the recommendations relate to increasing congressional control over the intelligence community, especially the CIA, and to improving the quality of management and of the intelligence product. The report recommends a permanent House Intelligence Oversight Committee, along with closer review of intelligence spending. While the committee would require that the CIA advise the House Intelligence Oversight Committee within 48 hours of the approval of any covert action operation, the main restriction recommended is to limit each operation to 12 months. Assassinations and paramilitary operations would be prohibited except in time of war, and the general approval mechanism for covert action operations would be institutionalized and upgraded. Finally, the Pike Committee recommended that the Director of Central Intelligence become a real manager of the whole intelligence community, and that an Inspector General for the community be established to watch out for abuses. Many will conclude that the Pike Committee failed because its recommendations were so limited, and in any case would serve to strengthen the CIA and the other agencies. To evaluate the committee's work, one must examine it along with the other investigative bodies, the Senate Investigating Committee under Frank Church, and the Rockefeller Commission. Both of these groups, and President Ford as well, in his reforms of February 18, 1976, concentrated quite naturally on the same areas as the Pike Committee: increasing congressional oversight, improving the quality of intelligence and the management of intelligence agencies and their budgets, and preventing future abuses. To expect more, like the completed abolition of covert action operations or prohibiting CIA support to foreign services that torture and murder, was unrealistic. After all, the CIA and the other services exist to protect both the government of which the investigators are a part and the private interests protected by the government. Yet, for all the limitations of the reform exercise, the work of the Pike Committee and the other bodies is an exceedingly positive chapter in American history. Who would have dreamed 2 years ago that such a great volume of information on secret American intervention in foreign countries would ever be made public? Who would have dreamed that the vast illegal domestic operations of the CIA, FBI, and NSA would be revealed in great detail? Every bit of this information, together with the general methodology that emerges, can be used by people and organizations to protect themselves now and when the next wave of the same occurs. No doubt, wide areas of CIA operations were omitted almost entirely, such as those in the trade union field. But no one can say the world's knowledge of secret intervention hasn't improved thanks to these investigations. Of equal importance is the continuing strength of the best popular traditions in the United States that the investigations demonstrate. The free flow of information, resistance to government bureaucracy, resistance to government secrecy and cover-ups. Through the effective functioning of these traditions, Americans have been able to learn how necessary corruption and hypocrisy are to the way the current system operates. Abolition of covert action operations which corrupt the country's expressed principles cannot come until fundamental changes are made in other institutions. Meanwhile, the treasure of knowledge gained through the investigations must surely contribute to the understanding that government in a liberal society must of necessity function in favor of one class and to the detriment of another. In July 1976, the chief investigator of the House Committee on Standards of Official Conduct, who had been trying since March to discover how the copies of Parts 1 and 2 of the Pike Report were leaked to Daniel Schorr, reported that nearly 50 copies of the report were in different executive and congressional offices when the leak occurred. None of the 207 government officials questioned, including Secretary Kissinger and the members of the Pike Committee, would admit to being the culprit. Thanks to one of them, at least, the Bertrand Russell Peace Foundation is able to present for the first time in book form Parts 1, 2, and 3 of the Pike Report, a document of truly historic significance not only for Americans, but also for peoples the world over who have suffered from clandestine American intervention. Cambridge, England, August 1976. This is Our Hidden History